I'd like to say a little bit about Unit 2 as you move into these new readings, why I chose them, and kind of questions that I hope to be able to explore with you um, uh, that they raise. The first thing I should say is that there's no need for the kind of lengthy commentary that I think that was proper for the first unit, having to do with readings that have very broad intellectual ambitions, you might say. Most of the readings for the rest of the course will not be those kind of readings. Now, in Unit 4, I think it is, when we start looking at basic moral philosophy questions, I think perhaps, although the readings are short, maybe some more commentaries in order. So what I plan to do is to keep these videos fairly short and to the point with regard to these essays and articles, state what I think is the main claim of the article and maybe some of the argument that supports that claim, and maybe have a few comments on it. But I don't think that these readings really require the kind of guidance, perhaps, or background or explanations that readings in Unit 1 from Marks, Tawney, and Smith did. There are 4 readings in Unit 2, and 2 of them you might group together, the Carr and the Friedman, and the second 2 you might group together as embodying a different attitude. But all 4 of them are meant to be read in the context of the question whether a class like this really is necessary, or if not necessary, whether it's even useful or practical or relevant to the practice of business. The first 2 articles take a general position about ethics in business, which really questions the validity, of course, in business ethics. The second 2 take a position which is more amenable to teaching business ethics, especially the third reading from Hooker, who advocates it specifically and looks at arguments against business ethics and tries to rip them apart one by one. But the first reading here by Albert C. Carr, who seems to have been a very interesting man. I have not been able to find anything Googling him, but I think he is a very interesting figure. But looking at is business bluffing ethical for now, we have a basic thesis and a kind of an argument in support of that thesis, which is mostly anecdotal, right? By which I mean the article is actually quite rich in examples, which is good. It's always good to have something concrete to think about, but then we have to put those anecdotes, those examples, which he claims to be real examples, but he gives no proof, so we can't really be absolutely sure of the veracity of the stories that he tells, but they're all told to back up his basic point, which is what? I mean, he states at several points, several times throughout the essay. For instance, at the top of page 144, the essential point I said is that the ethics of business are game ethics, different from the ethics of religion. And what game is he thinking about? On page 145, we can learn a good deal about the nature of business by comparing it with poker. And then if we look for the fullest, perhaps, statement of his position, just to sort of canvass the essay here to get started, on page 149, at the top of the first column, he says, I think it is fair to sum up the prevailing attitude of businessmen on ethics as follows. We live in what is probably the most competitive of the world's civilized societies. Our customs encourage a high degree of aggression in the individual striving for success. Business is our main area of competition, and it has been ritualized into a game of strategy. The basic rules of the game have been set by the government, which attempts to detect and punish business frauds. But as long as a company does not transgress the rules of the game set by law, it has a legal right to shape its strategy without reference to anything but its profits. If it takes a long-term view of its profits, it will preserve amicable relations so far as possible with those with whom it deals. A wise businessman will not seek advantage to the point where he generates dangerous hostility among employees, competitors, customers, government, or the public at large. But decisions in this area are, in the final test, decisions of strategy, not of ethics. So what is the basic thesis to sort of extrapolate on it? That business and ethics don't mix. That seems to be the thesis that comes out of that. That is that in business it's okay to act like you're playing poker in the sense that it's okay to bluff. What exactly bluffing is and how it differs from outright lying is not always clear within uh, the essay. There is some reference, some of the anecdotes, business and saying you should avoid malicious lies and things like that. And there is a reference to poker ethics. That is, that there are some things within poker itself, a game of poker, which are out of bounds, which suggests that poker has its own ethics. That there are game ethics, there are poker ethics, and therefore, I guess, business being a different game than poker, business having its own ethics. But so it's not quite clear whether Carr is saying that there's no relation between business and ethics, or whether he's saying that business has its own ethics, which are more profitably compared to poker and game strategy ethics than to religious ethics, what he's calling the ethics of everyday life, the ethics of private life. So that is, I think, a kind of a ambiguity in the thesis that is unresolved within the essay, and it's something to think about when we ask whether the essay is really coherent in what it says. So if in business different rules apply, that seems to be a consistent thing. You cannot simply translate the ethics that we accept in private life, which he kind of, like Tawny's presentation, connects with religious ethics, not ethics in general. You simply cannot translate those things into business life because you'll be punished for them. And you will miss opportunities. If the law, as written, gives a man a wide open chance to make a killing, he'd be a fool not to take advantage of it. If he doesn't, somebody else will, remarked a friend of the author. That's in the foreword. Well, it seems to be the attitude is that survival in business demands that we loosen our ethical standards. But what does that mean in practice? What sort of examples does he give of that? Some of them, it starts out in a pretty mild way, right? There's a reference to an applicant for a job filling out a psychological test, which asks him or her, I guess, what magazines they read. Was it his taste? And he lied about what magazines he reads. And as Carr says on page 145, this was a lie, yet within the accepted rules of the business game, no moral culpability attaches to it. That's actually in reference to another anecdote about an older man looking for a job who lied about his age. In both cases, Carr says that this is just a recognition that you can't always tell the truth in business if you're going to be in business. The old Harry Truman, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. That a certain degree of bluff, a certain degree of lying is absolutely required in certain situations. But those situations seem fairly mild. Lying about what magazines you read to avoid any kind of unpleasant questions about your political views. Lying about your age so you're not unemployed. These things don't seem to be terrible things and are fairly mild. But then we look at some of the other things he talks about. I guess the one that students are particularly interested in is the mouthwash example on page 148. He says, in one case, a firm manufactured a well-known mouthwash. I tried to figure it out by Googling it, but I can't nail it down. It's in the 60s, a long time ago. It was accused of using a cheap form of alcohol, possibly deleterious to health. That possibly helps, right? The ambiguity, questionableness of it. The company's chief executive, after testifying in Washington, made this comment privately, quote, "We broke no law. We're in a highly competitive industry. If we're going to stay in business, we have to look for profit wherever the law permits." Well, is that really comparable to lying on your employment application about your magazine tastes or even about your age? That's if you're making a product which is possibly harmful to health. That's what deleterious means, right? Harmful to. Is that within the rules of the game? Well, viewed in one way, of course it is. It's a strategic decision to maximize profits in the face of competition. That is, if you can get away with using a cheaper material in your product, you can increase your profit margins. And if the law does not keep you from doing that, then it would seem that in at least one version of this, that's perfectly okay to do. On the other hand, you're endangering people's health, possibly. Well, you are endangering it. You're not. It's just clear you're endangering people's health. Now, does that cross the line? Carr does not exactly endorse this company's strategy, this company's behavior, but it doesn't condemn it either. Another one on that page that can get to people is the example of the key manufacturer who is providing master keys for automobiles to mail order customers, although it was obvious that some of his purchasers might be automobile thieves. Again, the seller of that key can point to the law and say that he's broken no law, but is really, so under, again, as long as the law provides a chance for someone to make a killing, it'd be a fool not to take advantage of it. But what if they're selling master keys to car thieves? That is, it's perfectly lawful for the moment to do so, and one would imagine that if it became unlawful, the guy would stop doing it, as far as we know. But is it ethical? Well, it's not ethical to lie, and it's okay to lie on an application for employment about what magazines you read or what age you are, seemingly. But is it okay to provide the means for car thieves to steal people's property? Is it okay to endanger people's health with your product, even though it's legal? I mean, those sort of questions are really not as clear. But in reference to a young executive who was excited about an ethics code in his industry, he says, again on page 148, the illusion that business can afford to be guided by ethics as conceived in private life is often fostered by speeches and articles containing such phrases as "it pays to be ethical" or "sound ethics is good business." Actually, this is not an ethical position at all. It is a self-serving calculation in disguise. That even codes of ethics, even things that might rule out things like the using potentially dangerous materials in your product or selling things to thieves, that's all just public relations anyway. And the only reason anybody ever adopts a code of ethics is in their self-interest to preempt government regulation or make themselves look better to the public. It's another part of the game. It's another bluff. It's more deception. So what are we left with? I mean, there's so much more here, but there's no reason to go through it all. Just get a sense of what's going on. What are we left with here? Well, I mean, an ambiguous thesis. What is Carr saying? Is Carr saying that there's no need for business ethics because there's no ethics in business? Is he saying that business has a special type of ethics, like different games have special types of ethics, that it's okay in poker to bluff, it's not okay to outright cheat by having an ace up your sleeve, things like that? It's not exactly clear, but one thing is clear is that we would make, from his point of view, we would make a huge mistake were we simply to import our ethical standards from everyday life into the business context, and that any sort of attempt to ethicize business, to make business more moral by doing so, would be a huge mistake. So he at least calls into question the relation between morality and business and the usefulness of a class like this. seems to be predicated on the idea that you can do so.